Good morning, everybody. Thank you for joining today's refresher on the Windsor Framework. Today's webinar is an opportunity to provide an overview of these arrangements and hopefully offer some clarity to attendees so that they can mitigate any risks whilst maximising the opportunities dual market access can offer their business. Okay, as we have to do today because everything is so fluid, firstly, wish to provide a small, short disclaimer. Whilst arrangements negotiated between the UK government and the European Union under the Windsor Framework are now part of international law, the systems used and the schemes created under these arrangements are open to adjustment and change. Therefore, we cannot accept any liability for any accuracy, completeness, suitability of information provided, at a time in the future. Okay, a brief introduction to myself. My name is Jonathan Walsh, and I've spent the last 20 plus years working in international trade, 17 of those in industry, both here in the United Kingdom and in Ireland, but also in far-off places such as the Americas, Russia, continental Europe, and North Africa. I'm a full member of the Institute of Export and International Trade. I'm a fellow of the Institute of Consulting, and I hold both post and undergraduate qualifications in strategy, management, and economics. I've spent the last 7 years or so working in an advisory consultancy capacity with UK and EU-based traders, customs agents, and carriers around everything Brexit. But in particular, over the last couple of years, I've specialised in the area of trading under the Northern Ireland Protocol and now Windsor Framework arrangements. So let's first of all put this in a type of timeline so that we get an idea of where we were and where we are now. So up until Brexit, the UK was part of the EU Customs Union and Single Market. Now, Customs Union is a system under which member states follow a set of common rules over customs controls, and it's embedded in the founding treaty of the European Union. There's a common external tariff, and the application of the Union Customs Code applies within. Single Market is a deeper form of integration than a customs union, and it includes the EU, EEA countries, Norway, for example, and EFTA countries such as Switzerland, and seeks the freedom of movement of goods between the EU, EEA, and EFTA countries. So the European Union offers 4 core freedoms for its members. There's the 4 pillars as they are known. The free movement of people, free movement of goods, free movement of services, and the free movement of capital between member states. It's a market of, when the UK was part of it, around circa 515 million, and now circa 435 million or so. So since 2021, January the 1st, 2021, the UK left the EU single market after the Brexit referendum that took place in June 2016, triggering of Article 50, and all the different negotiations and discussions took place. Finally, after a transition period, the UK left the EU single market and customs union at the end of 2020. And since then, UK trade with the EU has been governed by the Northern Ireland Protocol Windsor Framework arrangements for Northern Ireland and by the Trade and Cooperation Agreement for Great Britain. Whilst the TCA allows tariff-free trade in goods between the UK, as in GB, and EU, trade barriers are higher than before, such as the requirement for customs declarations, rules of origin, and other non-tariff barriers to trade, i.e. regulatory compliance. And we will look at this in comparison to Northern Ireland's trading arrangements with the EU later on in our slides. Dual market access is a term that you will have heard often in recent months and recent years, and when Northern Ireland has been discussed. Our unique trading arrangements mean that goods originating in, manufactured in, and or physically located and in free circulation in Northern Ireland can be shipped and sold to customers in both the UK internal market, i.e. from Northern Ireland to Great Britain and the EU single market without any requirement to complete any administrative customs obligations or pay tariffs. They can move from Northern Ireland to both those markets, and we do not have to worry about the customs obligations that are applied elsewhere. So let's just kind of recap on what this means in different trading scenarios. So goods to and from Northern Ireland to the EU, as I've said, this is largely unaffected and remains very similar to what it was pre-Brexit. Goods from Northern Ireland to GB. Again, this is mostly unaffected. There is a list of a small number of prohibited and restricted goods that require export declarations. But in the main, products that are qualifying Northern Ireland goods, again, a term that we will discuss and use later on, can move freely from Northern Ireland to Great Britain. The Windsor Framework introduced new light touch requirements for not at risk goods moving from Great Britain to Northern Ireland. These are goods for sale and end use by consumers in Northern Ireland or the United Kingdom. And we will go through this in much more detail as we progress through the slides. At-risk movements, goods from GB to Northern Ireland. Since the Northern Ireland Protocol Windsor Framework arrangements came into play, they have a requirement now for digital administrative declarations, and for sanitary phytosanitary products, there is checks and requirements for export health certificates or veterinary certificates and so forth. Trading goods with the rest of the world. This is very important at the moment, especially in terms of trade with United States and other free trade agreements that the UK make with countries throughout the world. Northern Ireland benefits on exports from UK free trade agreements, and in terms of imports, they are treated a little bit differently. And then finally, goods that are moving in transit. Because the UK is no longer part of the European Union, when goods move from continental Europe to Northern Ireland via the GB land bridge, there is now a requirement for a transit accompanying document, a TAD as it's known. Otherwise, you would have to have an export declaration, an import declaration in an export declaration in the country in continental Europe, an import declaration in Great Britain. There's no export declaration requirements for goods moving from GB to NI, but there would be an import declaration requirement in Northern Ireland, and that removes that requirement. And also for goods going from GB to NI via Ireland, if they're going to be released into free circulation in Northern Ireland, they will require a transit document as well when passing over the Irish land bridge to Northern Ireland from Great Britain. Okay, we're going to go into much more detail on this as we go through our slides and our refresher here. So I'm going to start with trade with the European Union, because essentially this is the one that has seen the least change since 1st of January 2021. And in essence, Northern Ireland traders continue to enjoy access to the European Union single market for goods without any customs paperwork, physical checks on movements, or the application of tariffs on these movements. Under the Northern Ireland Protocol Windsor Framework arrangements, Articles 30 and 110 of the Treaty for the Function of the European Union, TFEU, continue to apply in the United Kingdom in respect of Northern Ireland. That means that no taxes or charges that wouldn't apply on goods moving between member states will apply on goods moving between Northern Ireland and an EU member state. Let's compare that to how trade is post-Brexit between Great Britain and the European Union. And if we look at it, Northern Ireland, as I said, there's no export or import declarations for goods moving between Northern Ireland and the European Union. No duty or charges on goods moving between Northern Ireland and the European Union. In terms of VAT, we use intercommunity VAT for business-to-business sales from VAT-registered companies. And we have one-stop shop for distance sales, business-to-consumer sales. There is EU regulatory alignment between Northern Ireland and the European Union, which means that there's no checks required in goods because we follow the same standards. We don't have a requirement for an authorised representative here in Northern Ireland under General Product Safety Regulations that were introduced last year, early this year. And there is no requirement for sanitary, phytosanitary checks or export health veterinary certificates on plants or on agri-food and so forth. Great Britain, however, which is trading under both the EU-UK Trade and Cooperation Agreement arrangements and WTO rules, have a requirement for export and import declarations on trade. There is duty charged unless the goods can meet preferential origin requirements under the UK-EU TCA. Import VAT is charged in all sales, albeit that postponed VAT accounting was introduced in the UK around that time of Brexit or in advance in preparation for Brexit. There is potential for regulatory divergence between the UK and the EU, which means that on occasions, goods may require both a UK certification and an EU certification, albeit that the CE mark has been recognised and will be recognised indefinitely in the United Kingdom. And GB manufacturers, under the GPSR, the EU General Product Safety Regulations, they require an authorised representative in the EU or Northern Ireland. We have the capacity here in Northern Ireland to be the authorised representative for GB manufacturers or for rest of world manufacturers. And then there is also sanitary, phytosanitary checks and certificates required until such time or if there is some sort of veterinary agreement agreed between the UK and the EU. So trade within the United Kingdom's internal market, and the emphasis here is on the internal market. So we move in goods from Northern Ireland to Great Britain. Again, this is where our dual market access comes in. There is unfettered access to the Great Britain marketplace for qualifying Northern Ireland goods. This means that there's no requirement to complete export or import declarations. There's a very, very small list, a dozen or so products that are P&R goods, prohibited and restricted goods that do require such documentation. There are no tariffs on Northern Ireland to GB sales of goods that are in free circulation in Northern Ireland at the point of sale to Great Britain. There is no additional compliance or labelling requirements in GB for qualified Northern Ireland goods. The UK government have put in protections to ensure that Northern Ireland goods being sold internally within the United Kingdom do not have to go through secondary approvals or meet additional labelling requirements or anything like that. And it's an internal UK sale for VAT purposes, i.e. if a sale is made between a Northern Ireland business to a Great Britain business, VAT is applied on invoice and then VAT is paid and accounted for via the VAT return of the companies. Qualifying Northern Ireland good, we just mentioned this term in fact, I've mentioned it a couple of times in slides so far. And in its simplest terms, qualifying Northern Ireland good are goods that are lawfully present, physically located in Northern Ireland at the point of sale and are not subject to any customs control, i.e. they are in free circulation in Northern Ireland. They're not in a bonded warehouse. They are not moving under transit. They are not in any way under inward processing reliefs or under outward processing reliefs or anything like that. And those goods have that unfettered access to the UK internal market. And this was at the insistence of the UK government during the negotiations to protect the UK market, one of the largest economies in the world, and this wanted to prevent other countries using Northern Ireland to circumvent the UK's borders and controls. So moving commercial goods from Great Britain to Northern Ireland, the emphasis earlier was on the internal market of the United Kingdom. This time round, it's about this commercial goods, this movement of commercial goods. As there is different rules for movement of goods between private consumer to consumer or private individuals to individuals. And again, we will touch on this briefly later on. Just on this as well, in order to maintain access to the European Union single market for goods, and as a result avoiding the need for physical customs infrastructure in the island of Ireland, and depending on who you speak to, there is understood to be between 250 and 350 border crossing points between Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland. Moving commercial goods from Great Britain to Northern Ireland is the area that has seen most change since the 1st of January 2021. The arrangements agreed under the Northern Ireland Protocol did cause some friction, both politically and socially in Northern Ireland and to a lesser degree in Great Britain. So at the start of 2023, the latter stages of 2022, the UK and EU set out to resolve some of those issues around internal UK trade, and these negotiations led to what we know now as the Windsor Framework. The Windsor Framework led to the restoration of our political institutions here in Northern Ireland, the return of the Northern Ireland Executive and the Northern Ireland Assembly. So what did we see is some of the resolutions that were introduced under the Windsor Framework. So in terms of business, what we've seen is that there's dispensations for GB to NI movements of retail SPS goods for end use and consumption in Northern Ireland. And this essentially allows the products that you will see in shelves in our big stores in Great Britain, or Sainsbury's, or Asda, or Tesco's, or Marks and Spencer's, you will also find on the shelves here in Northern Ireland as well. A new UK internal market scheme was introduced, replacing the previous UK trader scheme, which went further than the UKTS had done, where the UKTS only removed EU third country tariffs, i.e. towards all tariffs, or erga omnes in Latin, towards all tariffs. UKIMS also allowed for the removal of the requirement to complete import declarations on goods that were being traded internally for end use by consumers in Northern Ireland. And instead, they have to now complete internal market movement information under the simplified process for internal market movement. Again, we will look at this later on in our slides. New rules were introduced for parcel movements. These new rules came in on the 1st of May this year, and they introduced for the first time since January 1st, 2021, the requirement for customs declarations on at-risk goods, and they brought in similar simplified processes for freight movements as had been introduced under UKIMS from the 1st of May 2025. There was new EU quotas specifically put in place for the United Kingdom and Northern Ireland for the movement of steel from Great Britain to Northern Ireland, instead of having to use global quotas. A new duty rebate scheme was introduced. We had already the C220 process of reclaiming overpaid duty, but a new scheme was introduced, which HMRC have indicated as a 16-day turnaround after a successful claim, where a company pays duty on goods coming into Northern Ireland from either the rest of the world or Great Britain, and then they can provide evidence that those goods have remained within the United Kingdom, they can claim back that EU duty that has been paid. We had flexibilities around GB movements of seed potatoes and certain other plants. And we had all human medicines in Northern Ireland, including novel medicines, are now dealt with under the UK's MHRA as opposed to the EU's systems. Simplifications for GB NI pet movements. And we also had the introduction of the Stormont break, which allows the Northern Ireland Assembly, if they have 2 or more parties with a combination of more than 30 MLAs who believe that the introduction of a new law or a change in existing EU laws can have a detrimental impact on Northern Ireland, to have a vote that will lead to the UK government negotiating on Northern Ireland's behalf with the EU and putting the case to the EU why these laws will have implications for Northern Ireland. So the first one is the Northern Ireland Retail Movement Scheme. And this is the one that we probably could see most as consumers here in Northern Ireland. And a very, very high level example is I could be on the phone to a friend in Manchester or London or Glasgow or Cardiff or wherever in Great Britain, and they're telling me about a new product that they just picked up in Marks and Spencer's or in whatever one of the other stores, and they were saying how good it is. And when I went to go and get that same product in the store here in Northern Ireland, because of the Northern Ireland Protocol arrangements, I wasn't able to get it because it was on a prohibited and restricted goods list, or it was a chilled meat product or something that was prevented from being sold within these markets. The Northern Ireland Retail Movement Scheme allows these products to be sold within Northern Ireland, and they are dealt with and they are managed under the UK's Public Health Authority rules. And the Trusted Trader Scheme was also, this Northern Ireland Retail Movement Scheme, or Trusted Trader Scheme in essence, was extended to not only include retailers, but also wholesalers, caterers, and those providing food to public institutions like schools and hospitals to make those products available to them. As I say, it removed that ban on chilled British products, such as sausages, entering Northern Ireland, and have been strapped permanently, allowing for the same British products to be sold in the shelves in both GB and NI. And this Northern Ireland Retail Movement Scheme replaced the temporary STAMNI scheme that was there beforehand, and allowed one single document confirming that goods are staying in Northern Ireland are moved in line with the terms of internal market movement, instead of individual export health certificates or veterinary certificates, depending on if they are agri-foods or plant products or so forth. That you could have multiple requirements up to this previously. As I say, UK public health standards apply to all goods entering NI from GB for internal consumption and end use by consumers in Northern Ireland. So, are your commercial movements deemed to be at risk or not at risk? We've a lot of new terms that have been introduced when we speak about Northern Ireland. Dual market access, at risk, not at risk, waiver schemes, duty reimbursement schemes, and so forth. And what do we actually mean by that? And what does not at risk movements, what is a not at risk movement? So a not at risk movement from the 1st of May 2025, a consignment which is not at risk or considered not at risk of entering the European Union when moving from Great Britain to Northern Ireland, that can now move under a simplified process for internal market movements, i.e. it no longer has to complete import declaration, be that a full frontier declaration, or if you're completing via TSS, for example, where you have a simplified frontier declaration, and then after the movement takes place, a supplementary declaration. So when you provide internal market movement information, you have a reduced data set of information that is required. There is no customs charges applied on these internal market movements, and the process is much more simpler than the arrangements that are there for at-risk consignment. There is a prerequisite for declaring goods as not at risk. So the importer of record, i.e. the company responsible for the import into Northern Ireland, or the movement into Northern Ireland from Great Britain to Northern Ireland, or rest of the world to Northern Ireland in terms of applying UK tariffs as opposed to EU tariffs. Again, we will look at that in later slides. They must be first authorised under the UK Internal Market Scheme, UKIMS. And in order to be able to do that, they must have their Economic Operators Registration and Identification Number, starting with either GB or XI, linked to that UK Internal Market Scheme authorisation. The UK Internal Market Scheme is a trusted trader scheme. You're self-certifying that your goods are not at risk of entering the European Union, that they are for end use by consumers in Northern Ireland or the United Kingdom. So, sorry, that your goods are not at risk of entering the European Union, and that your goods are for end use, sale to or end use by consumers within Northern Ireland and the United Kingdom. Goods to be sold only in Northern Ireland and the United Kingdom will be freed then, as I say, of unnecessary paperwork, checks and duties. Previously on the UK trader scheme, only thing that was removed was EU third country duty. It's a trusted trader scheme, as I say, and it removes the burdensome requirement to complete import declarations, be that supplementary declarations, for UKIMS enrolled traders moving these not at risk consignment. We also see an expansion in the range of businesses that could benefit from these new arrangements. Under UK trader scheme, it was Northern Ireland companies, essentially only Northern Ireland companies, but now it's been expanded to GB-based businesses and commercial processors. The turnover threshold previously was 500,000. That has now been extended to 2 million. And there is a number of exempted end uses within construction, animal feed, healthcare, consumer food production, not-for-profit, that can benefit from these arrangements. We talk about freight movements, and then we talked about the introduction under the Windsor framework of new obligations on parcel movements via fast parcel operators. I did say earlier on that the important word was commercial. So there's a different treatment of goods, movement of goods between Great Britain and Northern Ireland for consumer to consumer, private individual, and business to business or business to consumer and so forth. So in terms of private individual, if I have a friend, an uncle, a parent, a cousin, whatever in Great Britain wanting to send something to me here in Northern Ireland, we remain an integral part of the United Kingdom. And there's essentially a waiver in place for all customs requirements on C2C movements. Northern Ireland citizens, that means that Northern Ireland citizens are unique in that we can not only receive parcels from Great Britain to Northern Ireland without any customs burdens, but because of the Windsor Framework Northern Ireland Protocol arrangements, we can receive goods from the EU without any customs burdens as well. For B2C and B2B movements, we have at risk and not at risk. So if they are not at risk movements, i.e. trusted traders under the UKIM, authorised under UKIMS, they can move goods with facilitations in line with Greenland freight movements, i.e. they're similar to simplified processes for internal market movements, or they are under a simplified process for internal market movements. They have a reduced data set of information to provide in terms of the information that is required, and they do not have to complete import declarations or subdecks, which are required for at-risk consignments and required for all commercial movements before 1st of May 2025. The reduced data set of information. In a subdeck, you can have up to 80 plus pieces of data that are required, whilst under the simplified process for internal market movements and internal market movement information, this is reduced significantly, reduced by about 70% to about 21 data sets, a number of them pre-populated. A lot of this information would be found in normal delivery dispatch documentations. I also want to point out at this point that HMRC also introduced, in line with the new arrangements on the 1st of May, their trader goods profile. And the trader goods profile was produced based on historical movements of goods that traders were traditionally bringing from GB to NI. And essentially what it did is it can be accessed via the Trader Support Service, and it helps autocomplete pre-populates sections based on commodity codes, countries of origin, the information that was used and has been used before. So it again reduces the requirement when you're moving non-at-risk goods under the SPIM, Simplified Process for Internal Market Movements, and providing either pre-movement or post-movement internal market movement information. So when you're moving goods brought into Northern Ireland as not at risk of moving to the EU, to recap, a trader moving these goods under the UK Internal Market Scheme will need to help keep some supporting evidence for each consignment they move. And this supporting evidence must be kept for 5 years and needs to be accessible at an address in the UK that HMRC can visit. Some examples of evidence could be commercial receipts and invoices, VAT invoices, commercial contracts, purchase orders, delivery receipts. And also when you are selling B2B as opposed to B2C, this has been considered under UKIMS. Where you may not be responsible for the end destination of the goods, you may still be able to be authorised to move goods as not at risk if you can make sure that the goods will meet the not at risk criteria, providing supporting evidence. This could be a statement from your customer that they only sell their goods from physical premises within the United Kingdom, that those goods are not sold into any other marketplace. They do not sell online outside of the United Kingdom's internal market or whatever. And those examples can be found online, and there is some links that hopefully will be available to you after the webinar. At-risk imports into Northern Ireland are treated differently than not at-risk movements. And at-risk movements essentially have the same rules applied as they would for any goods going into the European Union from a non-EU member state when they come in from Great Britain to Northern Ireland. And in terms of rest of the world to Northern Ireland, they have EU tariffs applied rather than UK tariffs applied to the goods. So an at-risk movement that are movements that are destined for the European Union, or they are considered at risk of entering the European Union. So if they're destined for the European Union, it may be that you are a Northern Ireland-based company. You're bringing goods in and your customer base is within Ireland or elsewhere in the European Union. You must complete an import declaration that can be done via the completion of a simplified frontier declaration pre-movement and a supplementary declaration post-movement. and EU tariffs are applied on those goods. Or it could be where your customer base is both in Northern Ireland and in the European Union. When you bring the goods in, for example, a wholesaler, you do not know where that end customer is going to be. And this is an opportunity. You will therefore declare those goods as at risk of entering the EU. You will complete the import declaration requirements, and you will apply the tariffs. But there is opportunities to mitigate against those risks, and we will look at those later on. So what are at-risk goods? Under Article 5 of the Northern Ireland Protocol, goods were deemed to be at risk unless they met certain criteria. Now, it was after the agreement of the Northern Ireland Protocol that we then had this ability and definition of not at risk goods. In fact, up until around July 2020, the EU had considered or were considering all goods moving from Great Britain to Northern Ireland as at risk. And then we had those agreements that were made in December 2020, and then, of course, the Windsor Framework Arrangements of February 2023 that made some definitions and allowed us to declare and consider certain goods as not at risk. But we had additional requirements for commercially processed goods that were moving into Northern Ireland. This is an extract from direct correspondence between myself and HMRC via the Trader Support Service. And this is in terms of what a trader must consider before they declare any goods that they bring in to Northern Ireland from Great Britain and declare them as not at risk or at risk. I think it's worth going through this. So what we were told was, please make sure that you're using the UK Internal Market Scheme correctly, under the terms of the scheme, and can comply with the compliance requirements of the scheme. You need to know at the time of movement that goods are not at risk of entering the EU and that goods will remain within the United Kingdom internal market. It is the responsibility of the UKIM's authorisation holder to know this for the goods movements, and they need to be able to hold evidence and supporting records of the movement for 5 years. And we discussed different types of evidence that can be presented previously. If you cannot evidence at the time of goods movement that those goods are not at risk, then you cannot declare those goods as not at risk under UKIMs. So a very straightforward, simple example. A business in the town that my offices are based here in Downpatrick, it only sells via its physical store in Northern Ireland, here in Downpatrick. They have suppliers in Great Britain. The goods come into the store here in Northern Ireland. They are only sold with somebody physically going into that store and purchasing it. They can apply and get authorised under UKIMs. They are certifying that their goods are not at risk, and their evidence is their receipts and so forth, and their sales directly to their customers. Then you have a store that sells, a company that sells through that physical store, but also have an online presence. But in their online presence, you can only purchase from BT or UK postcodes. That will be their evidence in terms of delivery dockets and sales invoices and so forth. Then you may have a wholesaler who sells both in Northern Ireland, the United Kingdom, but also in Ireland, into Ireland and the EU. They bring goods from their supplier in GB into Northern Ireland, but they do not know where those products could end up, because they could be purchased by a customer in Northern Ireland, or they could be purchased by a customer in Ireland or elsewhere, GB or EU. They cannot declare those goods as not at risk because they make them available for sale in these other markets as well. As I say, there's additional requirements, not different, additional requirements for goods subject to commercial processing. And as I said previously, up until the Northern Ireland Protocol was agreed and the Windsor Framework was agreed, all goods that were subject to commercial processing in Northern Ireland were automatically considered at risk under that article in the protocol. However, there is now some dispensations. There is a threshold of 2 million turnover, but you must also meet the standard eligibility criteria for UKIMS. It can't be a case that you're a commercial processor with a turnover of less than 2 million, but you also sell into the EU, Ireland or elsewhere in the EU. You must also be able to prove that your goods are entirely, wholly for sale and end use by consumers within Northern Ireland and the United Kingdom. And then you have exemptions for use, and that is, for example, construction, where you're forming a permanent, your materials that you're bringing in will form a permanent part of a structure in Northern Ireland. Some healthcare, there's exemptions for healthcare products, products that are being brought in by non-profit organisations for processing and manufacture within Northern Ireland, but they are not actually sold thereafter. They are given free of charge to individuals or to organisations. And animal feed that is being brought in that is for use by the importer and one other entity. Trade with the rest of the world, this has been very, very topical throughout the summer months, and really since April. We've been looking at this since the US's Liberation Day announcement in the White House. And how is trade with the rest of the world treated for Northern Ireland? So in terms of exports from Northern Ireland to outside of the UK and the European Union, obviously, as we said before, we've got dual market access to both the UK and the European Union. But outside of this, as stated in Article 4 of the Northern Ireland Protocol, nothing in this protocol should prevent the United Kingdom from including Northern Ireland in territorial scope of any agreement it may conclude with third countries. In other words, Northern Ireland goods benefit from UK free trade agreements. When the UK reaches a free trade agreement with a country or with a consortium of countries, Northern Ireland goods are deemed as being UK origin goods, with the caveat that they will have to meet preferential or non-preferential origin requirements. It can't be just, again, a term that came up during the summer, this idea of transshipment of movements. It can't just be sticking a label on a product to say it is made in the UK. There has to be a substantial transformative change takes place in Northern Ireland to the product for that to benefit. But Northern Ireland products benefit from UK free trade agreements for export. In terms of direct and indirect imports of rest of world products into Northern Ireland, at-risk goods moving into Northern Ireland will have EU tariffs applied, and there is some goods that are deemed automatically at risk. So if the EU tariff is equal to or greater than 3% higher than the UK global tariff, then those products will be automatically at risk. That applies in terms of rest of world imports into Northern Ireland directly. And then if there is trade remedies attached to goods, for example, if the EU applies safeguarding tariffs or anti-dumping duty or something like that, for example, to goods coming out of China, those goods are automatically deemed at risk because they have these safeguarding tariffs applied, and therefore these trade remedies will be applied, both for goods moving directly into Northern Ireland from China, for example, but also for Chinese origin goods coming from Great Britain into Northern Ireland, goods with trade remedies attached. So if your goods are at risk, what tariffs will apply and do you have to pay them? So I've said that when goods are deemed at risk of entering the European Union, when they're coming from Great Britain to Northern Ireland, or when they're coming from rest of the world to Northern Ireland, EU tariffs apply. And if EU tariffs apply and they're higher than UK tariffs, what options do you really have in terms of at-risk goods? We are very fortunate that here in the United Kingdom, we have exclusive access, and this is only to UK traders, to two schemes that were set up as a result of the Northern Ireland Protocol Windsor Framework arrangements. We have the Customs Duty Waiver Scheme, where we can use our de minimis allowance, which is 300,000 for most standard companies, 300,000 euros over a rolling 3-year period. And we can use our allowance to waive offset EU tariffs. So if it is at-risk goods moving from GB to NI, we can, and the tariff is, EU tariff is, for example, 5%, we can waive that. So if we're bringing in £1,000 worth of goods and the tariff to be applied is £50, we can use our de minimis allowance and we waive it, meaning we don't have to pay it. If we have, if we're bringing in goods from rest of world to Northern Ireland, and the EU tariff is 6% and the UK equivalent tariff is 3%, we can use our waiver to waive the difference between the UK and the EU tariff. So, i.e., we can waive the 3% difference between 6 and 3%, and then we pay only the 3% element of it. In addition to the Customs Duty Waiver Scheme, we have a Customs Duty Reimbursement Scheme. And this is where if we pay the duty on the goods when they come into Northern Ireland, then by either providing evidence of where the goods have ended up, they've either stayed in the United Kingdom or were exported outside of the United Kingdom and the European Union, we can apply to be reimbursed for those tariffs that we paid. Or we can also ask, if we paid the duty on these goods when we brought them in, we have up to 3 years then to ask that we now want to offset against that or de minimis allowance, i.e., we paid the tariffs, but we want to be reimbursed for those tariffs that we paid, and instead we want that applied against our allowance, our duty waiver, de minimis allowance. Those can be done, and that can be put in place. Also, don't forget that in addition to being able to use duty waiver schemes, we've obviously got an allowance or duty reimbursement scheme where we are applying after the fact, i.e. we have paid the duty and then have claimed it back. Under the UK-EU Trade and Cooperation Agreement, UK origin goods entering the European Union that meet preferential origin requirements, i.e. they have a statement on their invoice, we, the undersigned, declare unless otherwise clearly indicated that these goods have been manufactured in the United Kingdom, or a statement of origin for a period of up to 12 months, certifying, confirming that these goods meet UK preferential origin requirements. That also will remove the tariffs on those goods. So instead of having to use our waiver, which comes off our 300,000 allowance, or instead of having to pay and then produce evidence of where the goods are ended up, i.e. remain within the United Kingdom or were exported outside the UK and EU, if the goods meet UK origin requirements, we can declare those goods under preferential origin under the UK-EU TCA. So to just close off, Northern Ireland trade under the Windsor Framework. Let's just go back and do a recap. So goods to and from Northern Ireland to the EU, including Ireland, have been unaffected. Our goods still have access to the European Union single market for goods. So goods moving between Northern Ireland and the EU do not require customs declarations and do not require payment of tariffs duties. Goods from Northern Ireland to GB are mostly unaffected, except for a very, very small list of prohibited and restricted goods. Atlantic toothfish, mercury goods, torture goods, very, very small list. It's 11 or 12 goods in total. They do not require export declarations. They do not require import declarations in Great Britain, and there is no tariffs applied. Non-at-risk goods are goods that are for end use, sale to or end use by consumers in Northern Ireland. They move under these new simplified process for internal market movements and production of internal market movement information, as opposed to the requirement to complete import declarations, including supplementary declarations. At-risk goods moving from GB to Northern Ireland. There is no export declaration requirements in Great Britain, but there is an import declaration, an online import declaration requirement, administrative digital declaration, and checks, sanitary, phytosanitary checks. But we also have the schemes such as the duty waiver scheme, the duty reimbursement scheme, which allows us to remove or waive any associated tariffs. And the UK government have the Trader Support Service, which allows us via free at source portal into the Customs Declaration Service to complete these declarations ourselves instead of having to use external customs partner. And then in terms of rest of the world, be it trade with the US, for example, our goods are deemed as being UK origin and therefore will benefit from reduced tariff duty rates on exports into the United States or to any country that the UK has agreed a free trade agreement. In terms of imports, they are treated a little bit differently. If there is any trade remedies, they are automatically deemed at risk, and EU trade remedies will apply. And then transit is used for goods moving via the GB land bridge when moving goods from continental Europe, or when moving goods from GB to NI via Northern Ireland, where you don't have a setup in the Republic of Ireland. You have the ability to use transit and release the goods into free circulation then in Northern Ireland. Okay, we've covered a lot today, so thank you for your attendance. Thank you for your attention during this presentation. And now we have an opportunity to have some Q&A.